Good morning. Welcome to Saw Shop. Well, you see, I ain't in the shop. I'm on the road today, and I'm gonna be on the road for a while. And my bracket that holds my phone ain't acting right, so I had to do a little prop up. But I thought while I was riding down the road, I'd pass a little time. I'd make a little video. I get a lot of questions about how do you decide what you're going to do when you build a saw, like porting wise and timing and those kind of things. And it's not just a simple answer. You know, there's lots of things that go into that. No two saws I build are exactly the same. Some sizes are easier to replicate than others. So what I mean when I say that is, you know, timing on a saw really depends on what you're going to use it for. What's the main purpose? I always try to find out when somebody wants a saw ported is like, what do you do with this thing? What size bar are you running? What's the end goal that you want from it? Because there's lots of ways to make power, but it ain't all about just power. It's about power, it's about torque, it's about throttle response, and in some saws, honestly, you can get it all, but in some, you've got to, sometimes you sacrifice something to gain something else when you're moving these ports around and those kind of things. And then there's ways to go about it so you can improve some of these things as you take away from them, so you keep that about like it was, but something else is so much stronger. So it really, that's one of the things. If I'm porting a chainsaw, I'm not going to port a lemon saw the same way I'm going to cut a bucking saw or a felling saw. So I guess you need that to kind of understand where we go from here. All right. So when I'm getting into it, I think of like three different kind of sizes. I think of the top handles up to 50 cc, that range. What a lot of people, you know, if you use them commercially, then you would probably say, oh, these are lemon saws, topping saws, climbing saws. But then some people climb with a 500i. Some people climb with a 562 or a 372, or it just depends. But for your typical person, that smaller 40 to 50 cc range, that's one style saw, and that's a one kind of porting that I normally do. And then you get to probably what's the most common ported saw that I run into, and it's the 60 cc class. That's going to be your 036s, 360s, 361s, 362s, 562. You know, that 262. There's a whole bunch in that range. You know, the Echo 620. You know, that size saw. And then I'm gonna port a certain way there, because those saws are normally used for bucking firewood, general purpose. Sometimes, occasionally you'll see somebody that's running a 28, 32-inch bar on a 60cc chainsaw, but it's not normal. Can they do it? Yeah, they can do it. I see old Buck and Billy Ray all the time running one on a 562 or whatever, but for the most people, that's not what they're going to use. They're going to use a 20-inch bar in most cases. They might use a 24, but most cases, standard operating, 20-inch bar is going to do what most people want it to do, and that's what they're going to run on it. So that's what we usually port to that. And then you got the bigger saws. You got the 70 and up classification. Those saws that I consider, you can buck with them, but they're normally more for, felling trees, big wood, running on a mill, whatever. And that's your 70 to 90 cc, rarely on occasion have I even worked on one of those big 880s or 3120s, because in that case you're dealing with so much power there. Most people are not looking to port those things, and it's what they're used for, and that's it. But so those are really the three different areas that I look at when I'm porting. My phone is trying to tilt on me. Let me get you adjusted again. But so then how do I decide what I'm gonna do? Well, I go at it from this standpoint. I have a standard. This thing keeps wanting to tilt on me. There we go. I have a standard that I use. That's a good baseline. My standard for a good baseline on any saw that'll make it a really good wood support runnability saw is I shoot for 100 on the exhaust, and I learned how to read one after bottom dead center on the intake. A lot of people, it's after top dead center. It's after top dead center, but on the intake. But I call it 102. A lot of people call it 78. So if you ever watch my videos and I say an intake's 100, and you're like, God, how does that thing even run? It's because the way I read the wheel is after bottom dead center opening. And so I look for, as a standard, 100 on the exhaust, 102 on the intake. That gives me durations of 160 on the exhaust and gives me duration of 156 on the intake. Well, we'll get to transfers in a minute. But what I'm looking for is, in them different classifications of saw, I'll do something totally different. On a lemon saw, I may look to get maybe a little higher in the exhaust, get more RPM, because torque is not at a premium. Yeah, I know they're small CCs, but if you're using a saw like you should, you're not taking a 40cc saw and trying to buck 16-inch firewood with it. That ain't what it's used for. That's not its purpose. It's for limbing, cutting tops from trees, things like that. And you want fast chain speed, awesome throttle response is what you're after. You want wow, 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 and you're wanting for it to be fast, quick cuts. And so raising the exhaust roof will give it more RPM right off the go. Well, when you raise the exhaust roof, then that allows you opportunity to lower the intake floor some to kind of match what you're doing, and that's where that awesome throttle response comes from. And because what it's doing is you're getting the intake open quicker, sucking more fuel, more air into the engine. And more air, more fuel makes a greater combustion. Therefore, you're packing more air in there, which is getting compression up. So all those things go hand in hand with throttle response. Well, and then let's look at transfers on what I do there. On a small saw, I'm looking, in that case where you're looking for throttle response, everybody talks about upper transfer, lower transfers. Well, what it indicates, lower transfers is where the air enters the transfers down around the crankcase part. Upper transfers is where it blows fuel charged air above the piston into the combustion chamber. And so the transfer runner is just the runner that gets you from the lower to the upper, that runs up through the side of the cylinder head somewhere or another. So if I had to say which one is most important, normally what I found is lower transfer work is always more important, almost always, than upper transfer work. Because lower transfer work is how you get the air into the tunnel. And in a lot of these saws, the transition in that tunnel ain't the greatest. Sometimes they're at 90 degrees trying to make the air bend 90 degrees to flow up in there. So there's a lot of work you can do on saws in that lower transfer area. Man, this phone does not want to stay level. But, so, that's where I do most of my work. Occasionally, I'll do a little cleaning in the uppers. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I do very little work under the upper transfers unless the saw has a necessity that it needs to be done. I usually look for somewhere between 22 to 25 degrees blow down in my saws. Some saws like a little less. Some of your smaller CC saws can run on a little bit less. Some of your bigger ones, I usually tend to go closer to 25, 24, 25. But normally it's just cleaning them up, make sure we don't have no slag from casting, things like that to slow down, to impede the process. Well, you say, why don't you do a lot of work in the top? Well, it kind of goes back to a physics thing for me. I think of, I've used this analogy sometimes, is I think of a water hose. If I hook a water hose up to the spigot and it don't have an end on it, it's just an open water hose, and I turn that water on, it's flowing a good bit of water through there. But there's not a whole lot of pressure at the end. It's just whatever's coming out of the line through the hose just going out the end. And then if I shut the water hose back off and then I screw on a sprayer nozzle and open it wide open, when I turn it on, that water is got lots of pressure. The volume ain't there that was there before, but there's a ton of pressure out the end. All right, so think about that in an internal combustion engine. Smaller CC chainsaw, where air and fuel volume is not as much a necessity as great throttle response, great fuel mixture, super high combustion. You want high flow, high pressure, or you want high pressure over high flow. So you clean it up, smooth it out, so it helps you flow, but then you're packing air. You're starting big and you're going smaller as you go up the transfers. And when they're coming out the top, it is a charged mixture. Like, it's charged with pressure. So you get a better bust, a more efficient, cleaner, and it should be a hotter. When it's cleaner and more efficient, it's gonna be a hotter combustion. All right, and then you can control how much fuel you need to control a lot of things with mixture screws and those kind of things. On the opposite side of the coin to that, you got a 660 or a 395 or even a 460, even 440, 372, those bigger combustion chainsaws. What I would do is I would do more work in the top of transfers, because I'm wanting to make those more cylindrical in nature, not as much of a cone, just a little smaller at the top than they are at the bottom, so you get to keep the pressure up and you'll charge it. On the exhaust side, I probably are gonna tend to stay around 100, but on the intake, I'm gonna get pretty close to 100 as well. I shoot just to stay below it. So if it's 100, then I'm looking at 101. 99, I'm looking at 100. Trying to be right in there, because what I'm not after as much on throttle response as I am wide open power. You get me? Because most time on a big saw like that, you're running a minimum of 24-inch bar up to 36. That's a standard, anywhere from 24 to 36. Some people run a bigger bar than that on them. But if you just went to my shop right now, my big saws, my 70s is gonna have 24, but my 90cc saws are gonna be sitting there ready to go with a 28-inch bar on them. And I've got up to 36, because you're normally with those saws, you're not out there just limbing and doing standard bucking work unless you got a big tree. That's a lot of saw to stand there and buck with all day long. It's normally used for stump cutting, felling cuts, anything where you're going to be on the throttle for, I say 30 seconds up. People say 30 seconds ain't long. At wide open throttle, 30 seconds is a pretty good long time on the chainsaw. Because honestly, most cuts that you're going to make in the woods are 5 seconds or less, and you're through. But in a lot of cases, say you're milling, you may be wide open throttle for 2 to 3 minutes or more per cut. So that is a long time. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize airflow, maximize fuel delivery. Because you got to think you got a heat cooling issue going on, especially on the mill. So you tend to run it a little richer on the mill. And you want maximum flow through that thing, just like on the water hose without the end on it. You just turn it on and you just gushing it through there. You don't really want nothing throwing it down. It's like air in, air out, air in, air out. Because more air you get in, more fuel you get in, the more combustion you're going to have, more power you're going to make. You're not really worried about throttle response at that point in time. You're worried about wide open throttle. And so, like I said, on those, transfers would be more of a smaller decrease to the top to maximize flow. And you get bigger with your intake ports and the exhaust ports as good as you could get to just float air through. All right. And then I think of the happy medium, which is where most get ported to. I mean, most saws that come in and get ported, I always start with 100, 102. Always. And I find a transfer mix that's somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in that area that between that little saw and that big saw. It's gonna have a little more taper than the big one, probably a little less than the small one. I'm looking for CCC is all around good, all around saw. I'm looking for something that still pops good under throttle, but it also has good torque out the back end. And so 100, 102 gets you really close to that number. And then what you'll find, I mean, I've ported hundreds of chainsaws now, and what you find is certain saws like certain things. Like 5 Series Huskies, they like a little less blowdown than some of the other saws. They also run at a little higher exhaust roof because they're a little higher strung, where other saw may not. I think of a Makita 6100, low exhaust roof. It's really designed more of a torque monster. So raising the exhaust roof on them is a game changer for that saw. You can, certain saws poured out better because when they say they poured out better, it's all about gains made. I'll tell you, a 5 Series Husky, there's not the gains in a 5 Series Husky that you're going to get, say, out of a 362 steel or a Echo 590 or 620. Or the largest gain that I've ever seen in a saw from stock to ported that I ported was a Makita 6100. After that, some of the largest gains that I traditionally see is on like a homeowner saw, and it's a 391. There's things, certain saws respond well or better. They all respond well to porting. All saws do. People say, well, they just didn't port good. Well, didn't port good might only been a 15% increase. But some saws we see 30 to 40% increases on. And in cut speed, it may double, or cut the cut speed in half. So with that said, I hope you kind of understand what I'm talking about port timing. Why It's just not one size fits all. You can't just port everything to 100, port everything to 102, grind the transfers out all the way through on all saws, because really you will hurt some of them if you don't know what you're doing. That's why I'd recommend you let somebody that knows what they're doing do the work. Yeah, you might can do it yourself, but I would recommend you let somebody that knows what they're doing the work, because an OEM cylinder head is expensive, and that's not something you want to screw up. If you want to play around on the saw, go buy you a Farmer Tech cylinder head. It's cheap. You can learn to work on it. You can grind it. You can test it out. That's how I learned. I learned on clones. Learned different recipes, learned what worked, and then I replicated them into more OEM products that were customer based. So, with that being said, let's talk about squish just a second. Squish is very important. That's what controls usually the amount of compression you got. And a lot of times you can accomplish a good squish number just through a base gasket delete. But sometimes deleting the base gasket is too much or not enough, just depending on how the cylinder heads are made from the factory. You know, I think of many of your Husky products, you can base gasket delete and wind up somewhere around 22 to 25 just with a base gasket delete, because most of them from the factory are somewhere between 35 and 40 thousandths in the squish. You can drop the base gasket delete off. Most of those factory base gaskets around 15, and you'll have a really good number. It's going to increase the performance of the saw. It's going to feel a whole lot better, and you can seal it up and go, and that'll be good on your squish. But then I think of some of your saws, like some of your newer steels, you can do that. Like your newer stuff, 362s, 400s, 661s, that kind of stuff, you can base gasket delete. 500Is, all that can be base gasket deleted now, because they build them with a higher squish number. But if you're working on something like a 026, 036, 260, 360, 044, 440, a lot of times you're going to be hard pressed to delete the base gasket, because you're going to get too tight in the squish. I worked on one here about a month and a half ago. Somebody had ported and built for somebody. It was an 026. They base gasket deleted it and blew the saw up, because it would rotate. But if you were slowly rotating, railroad track. If you were slowly rotating that saw, you could feel it get against, and it almost got into a bind at the top before it rolled over. So I would say that probably they had that squish down less than around 10 or less, and it was. So what that means is when it got hot and everything starts expanding, it was hitting the cylinder head. Well, it wasn't running when he brought it back. I took the cylinder head off. Well, the part of the piston skirt was missing on the intake side. Well, what was happening was the piston was hitting above the exhaust on the exhaust side in the top of the cylinder head, and every time it hit, it was flapping it was rocking the skirt. It was rocking the skirt on the intake side into the cylinder wall, until it finally just broke it off. And then that metal off of the piston got into crank bearings and just trashed that engine. Trashed the bearings, cylinder head. So that person spent a pretty good bit of money with me. But we put it all back OEM. Had to change crank bearings out. Do all that stuff, crank seals, everything had to be changed out. I put a base gasket back in when I went back together. But then we machined some metal off the bottom of the cylinder head to accomplish the squish we was after. So it's just not all just, as you can see, it's not just like a one piece fits everything. Sometimes you may need to drop it and then go up in there. Maybe the combustion chamber is pretty big, but the squish band's kind of low. So you might have to drop the cylinder head down and then go up into the squish band and cut it some to get the cylinder, to make clearance for the piston. But you need to drop the cylinder head to get your timing right if the ports don't line up like you like it. So there's a lot of different things you run into. And then you have the clamshell style saws. You can't really do anything with those saws to change the squish, except for if you have the means to recut pockets for the crank. You can resurface the crank pocket a little bit, but you're talking a lot of work for a saw that's not going to have the value that you put into it. So most people don't do that. But anyway, I hope I've helped y'all. I hope y'all maybe understand what goes into it. All these thoughts go into it before you ever lay a piece of cutter into that metal. Anytime, every saw I do, they've been timed on a wheel. I make a plan. We write it down on paper, make a plan of attack, mark out the cylinder head, and that's what we go to. If you don't mark it, you tend to cut. Normally, you don't cut enough, is what I find. Because you say, oh, I done got a bunch out of there. But you haven't cut to where you really needed to. So, I usually mark with a Sharpie, and that gives you a good line to cut to. Die caliper will give you what you need to know. Usually, you can. I also take a little file, gauge file, and I'll see what 1 degree is in thousandths. I'll roll it down, stick the filler gauge in the top of the exhaust port. I'll roll the cylinder back up until it hits, and I'll see what that degrees is, and then I'll move it 1 degree, and then I'll take and use the filler gauge to see how many thousandths that actually was that it changed. And that gives me an idea of, when I'm looking at, I need to drop it 3 degrees, well, now I know how many thousandths that is going to be. And so you got to know all that before you can make a plan. But anyway, all right. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. I know you didn't see much from me driving a vehicle down the road, but I hope I provided you with some info that you'll find useful. All right, signing off from the saw shop. Y'all have a good one.